Hello there! When we started developing the second half of the Teardown campaign, we felt there was a need to move away from the two-dimensional height maps that we used for the terrain in part 1. We wanted something a bit more flexible, that also supported overhangs, arches, caves, and other terrain features like that. In part 1, we had to come up with some creative solutions whenever a level required caves or tunnels. Like the cave in Hollow Rock Island, which is made from two height maps where one is turned upside down, or the tunnel under the hub, which also is an upside down height map. We wanted to be able to do that kind of things without resorting to height map trickery. So based on the specifications and requirements from the content team, Ludde started developing a tool to meet our requirements. That tool became Voxtool, which I am going to show you how to use today. The core functionality of Voxtool is to take a textured 3D mesh and turn it into a Vox file, which can be used in Teardown. It has a more support functionality, but in this video we will focus on the core mesh to voxels functionality. Voxtool is expecting a UV unwrapped mesh, saved as an OBJ file. It also requires a few texture maps which should be baked out from the 3D application used for creating the mesh. Furthermore, the mesh needs to be airtight and manifold. In this tutorial, you are expected to know how to create a 3D mesh, UV unwrap it, texture it, and bake out the textures. I am using Blender for making the meshes used for Teardown levels, but any 3D software which can export OBJ files should do. Here's a very basic terrain I've made, and these are the textures I've applied to it, both as applied on the model and as baked out texture maps. Color. This will control what colors the voxels in the final model will have. Displacement. This texture controls how bumps and indentations will be added to the terrain. It is more efficient to add surface details in the displacement map than modeling it in a higher resolution mesh, because a higher resolution mesh is more taxing to work with. Grass coverage. This is a texture controlling where and what amount of grass will be applied to the terrain. Grass is added by Voxtool, which have parameters for max height of the grass and max density. Grass color. This texture is used to define the color of the applied grass. This lets you have green grass even if the underlying ground is a bright sandy color or a brownish dirt color. There is a parameter in Voxtool which lets you blend the grass color between the colors in the grass color texture and the color texture. When this parameter is used, Voxtool tries to find the closest match to the color of the ground, but only from the available colors in the grass color texture. Material. This texture is a bit special. It uses the red, green and blue color channels to control what material the voxels should be made of in different parts of the terrain. Where the color channels blend into each other, it will pick the dominant color. So let's open Voxtool. Here we are in Voxtool. There are a number of tabs up here for different support functions. Today we're going to focus on the mesh to voxel functionality. The first thing is to choose the input mesh that we will use to create our terrain. So I click over here in the file selector, and here I have my terrain OBJ file. I get this preview of OBJ files. I'm not sure if this is default Windows behavior or if I get this because of some program I have installed. But anyway, let's select this file. We have a number of options here. Swap YC, which is used because in, for example, Blender, Y is the up direction, and in MagicVoxel, C is the up direction. So I have this set as true. Uniform scale. When you make your terrain mesh, you should preferably make it in a meter scale, but if you've managed to make your mesh much smaller than you intended, you can use this uniform scale value to scale it up or scale it down. User-defined size
if you set this to true, you can use these XYZ parameters to set the size of the mesh in those directions. Next, we have an input height map, and we are not going to look at that today, but VoxTool can work with a height map instead of a mesh to create terrains. And benefit of VoxTool over the ground.lua Vox script that we've used to create terrains previously is that it can read 16-bit PNG files. So you get much smoother graduations across your terrain. For example, if you want to make a terrain that is taller than 256 voxels. This is the file where we are going to output our Vox file. I'm naming it terrain, like that. And now we come to the texture maps that we're going to apply to the mesh. The first one is the color map file. And I select that one. And we have a couple of parameters here. And these two are if you do not supply a color map. You can make a terrain that is just one single color. And this is the palette index that will be used for that color, and this is the actual color that will be used. Transparency clip value is you can use if you have transparency in the color map file to cut away parts of your terrain. I'm not going to look into that today. Next, we have the material map file. So I'm picking that one. And if we take a look at my mesh with the color map and the material map applied, we can see that the red channel is used for all the cliffs or rocks. And I choose the default brick as material here. It might be tempting to use rock for those areas, but since rock is an indestructible material in Teardown, if you use rock, you won't get any like pieces falling off when you shoot at it or place explosions and stuff like that. So brick is a good alternative for that. Then the green channel is where like the ground soil is, and dirt is a good choice for that. And the blue channel is down at the bottom of the terrain where I'm imagining it will be meeting the water. And it is mostly stones, and I'm using concrete for that. Next up is the displacement map. I'm choosing it here. And we have a couple of parameters here. The first is to normalize the displacement map. And this is if you bake out a displacement map and it is not fully utilizing the full range between complete black and complete white. The normalize function will try to expand the range used in the displacement map to use as much as possible of the available range of grayscale colors. I'm leaving that off. And then we have another parameter which is interesting. Signed displacement map false. This means that by default, the displacement map is handled as an unsigned displacement map. And I will pull up Magica Voxel to try to visualize the difference between signed and unsigned displacement maps. So let's say that we are looking at our terrain cross-section from the side. So this is the terrain that would be generated based off the mesh that we have input to the Vox file. And then we have a displacement map. Let's say it looks like something like this. It looks something like that. And black for an unsigned displacement map means no bump. And pure white means maximum bump. If we go back to VoxTool, we see that we have a value here called max height. And this is what will be used for the totally white value. So let's put that at 6. This means that when the terrain is generated, here where the displacement map is white, the mesh or the terrain will be bumped to the max value 6. So let's take a look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And this here is 50% gray, so that will be 3, 1, 2, 3 voxels. And then VoxTool ties it together. So we will have a terrain that looks something like this. So black has no effect, and the brighter it gets, the more the terrain is bumped upwards from the base mesh. But let's say we have assigned displacement map. So I'm going to make a new. This is our base terrain as it would be generated just from where the mesh is. And for assigned displacement map, this 50% gray represent the same level as the base mesh. And anything that is brighter will be bumped up from the default mesh location by the amount of the max height. So in this case, 6 voxel up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And VoxTool ties it up nicely like that. And black will be bumped, or not bumped, it will be indentations into the base mesh by the amount of the max height value. So in this case, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And tied up like this. So this is where the terrain would be generated if it was just from the mesh data. And with the displacement added for a signed displacement map, we can see that any value darker than 50% gray creates indentations in the terrain, and any values brighter than 50% gray creates bumps in the terrain. I hope that made it somewhat clearer. So I'm going to use a signed displacement map, so I will get both bumps and indentations. We will not be looking at the soil functionality today. And next up is the grass map. So I will pick that one. This is the grass coverage map. And then we have a choice to normalize it, just like for the displacement map. And then we have a color map file for the grass, which is this one. And I'm going to leave these default values. They are for max height and max density. So where the grass coverage map is completely white, the grass will be 5 voxels tall, and it will have a ground coverage of about 60%. And then it will gradually fade based on where the grass coverage map is fading into black. The material I'm using for grass is Sounds Physical. You can choose any other material, but physical is recommended so that you don't have cars riding on top of the grass and stuff like that. The ground blend I will go into in a future video. Then we come to the fill layers, and this is underneath the terrain that is created. We can have a fill function create a internal shell of unbreakable voxels, so that if the player makes a hole in the ground, they don't fall through the terrain. And to use that, we will have to use the flood fill type. I will take a look at raster fill in a future video. We are not talking about that today. And I am going to create 4 layers of indestructible rock underneath my terrain. And again, I will pull up MagicVoxel to show why this is a good idea. Okay, so let's say you have a terrain that looks something like that. And then you have an indestructible layer underneath it, and it will be cleanly connected like this. So this is a cut through of the terrain, with the terrain in this purple up here and an indestructible layer of voxels created underneath. Now let's say you want to create a house on this hillside or this slope. So you create a foundation for the house, something like this. And then you move this foundation down into the ground like this, so that it eats into the ground, so you can properly build it in place. I want to build a house on top of this here. But if a player comes along here and they use explosives or a shotgun or anything to destroy the foundation, you see that destroying the foundation creates a hole through the terrain. So if we back this up a bit and we create more layers of indestructible terrain underneath the top layer. Now, if we put this house foundation eating into the ground like this, and a player comes along and destroys it, we are not punching a hole through the terrain where people can fall through. So having more layers of indestructible underneath the top layer of the terrain gives you some margin if you want to create something that needs to eat into the terrain, like house foundations and stuff like that. Back to VoxTool. So I'm creating 4 layers of rock underneath my terrain. This beginning and end color for the rock material in the palette, VoxTool will create a range of colors from this color to this color. And then when the indestructible layer is created, it will try to match the color for the indestructible layer with the colors of the overlying terrain. So that if you blow away a piece of ground somewhere, the indestructible layer underneath should resemble the texture of that piece of ground you blew away. Solid fill is if you want to fill the whole mesh completely. We do not use that, but I imagine there could be some situation. For example, if you use VoxTool to create tree trunks or something like that, you probably would like to fill them internally with wood or something, so that they are not empty. Trim is another function that if you look at the mesh I made for this example, you can see that it has these black sides and the black underside. And those are totally unnecessary to have in the game. So if you want to cut away that, you can use these values to cut into the model from the sides and from the top and from the bottom to remove a certain amount of voxel from these directions. We'll take a look at this after we've looked at the first iteration of the terrain in MagicVoxel. Finally, we have some options. The first one is use HSV colors. This takes a little bit more time to generate the terrain, but usually gives a better result than using RGB colors, which it is if this is set to false. Compressed output is something you should use at least for the final version of your terrains if you plan to upload them to the workshop or something like that. Compressed Vox file is 100 megabyte terrain is 10 megabyte compressed. The downside to this is that you cannot open compressed Vox files in MagicVoxel. So you can't take a look at them in MagicVoxel, stuff like that. But you can use them in the teardown editor. I'm turning this off so we can have a look at the terrain in MagicVoxel before we bring it into the game. The maximum size of model in Magica is, I believe, 2000 by 2000 by 2000 voxels. And with VoxTool, you can make terrains that are larger than this. But if you open a model that is larger than what is allowed in Magica Voxel will take those shapes that are lying outside its boundaries and pull them inside the allowed space, messing up the model. And in that case, you could set this to true, and VoxTool will generate several vox files that are all within the size allowance of Magica Voxel, and then you have to stitch them together in the teardown editor. Gamma adjust colors is to sometimes when PNG files are saved, there is a gamma curve applied to the PNG, and this can be used to kind of mitigate that, trying to bring the PNG file back to linear space. If you understood that, then you probably also know why and how you would use it. Optimization is something we will look into in a future video, but basically to get the best performance in teardown, there's a balance between the number of shapes in your terrain and how much air there is in those shapes. And the optimization process is trying to find this best balance between number of shapes and trying to minimize the amount of air in them. Connect voxels in object. This is especially useful for organic shapes like trees and bushes and stuff like that, where there is usually or often some voxels that are not properly connected. They are only connected edge to edge or corner to corner instead of side to side as is required for a voxel to be regarded as properly connected in teardown. And if you put this to true, then the VoxTool will try to find all those cases and connect them properly, so you have a proper model. I set this to false because we're not looking into that today. And voxel size is the size of the voxels in a meter scale. So there with 0.1 you have 10 voxels to a meter, which is the same scale we use for teardown. If you made a terrain and you push it through VoxTool and you bring it into the game and you take a look at it and you say, oh, this is way too small, you could like lower this value to 0.05 and run it through VoxTool again, and now it will be twice as big inside the game. Max shape, you should just leave the default values until we've made a proper video talking about optimization of the terrains. So with all this said, I'm going to export my all these options, my settings. I'm calling it settings, so I can load them up again if I want to go through these and change something or stuff like that. And I press generate vox. And that's it. Now let's take a look. Here I have the folder where I created the vox file. I'm opening it in my voxel. I'm pressing Ctrl A to choose everything and G to put it on the ground plane. Then F1 to render it. Up the exposure a bit. And this is what it looks like. And here you can see the black sides I was talking about. Those are kind of unnecessary in the game, so we're going to try to remove them by using the trim functions. But this looks pretty good. I think maybe the displacement is a bit weak. I'm gonna bump it up a bit. So exiting the rendering, going back to VoxTool. Let's raise the max height, maybe also normalize the displacement map. And let's remove 20 voxels from the negative x direction, 20 from the positive x direction. That would mean this is the negative x direction. The red axis here is x. This is the positive, so I'm removing 20 voxels here, 20 voxels there, 20 from negative Y, and 20 from positive Y. From negative Z, I think I'm removing something like, let's see. .35. And we generate the vox again. I go back to my voxel and open it, Control A, G, F1 for render. Now I remove those sides and the underside. And like it's pretty okay. Have a look at the cliffs. Yeah, this is kind of cool. I think this is good. We can take a look here at the side. It's a good space. So here you can see this is the grass that's been generated. This is the actual like terrain layer, which is destructible. I can alt click here and see to select the colors, and I can see that yes, this is all dirt. And down here we have rock. So you can see it's tried to match. If I select all the dirt, that, and I delete it, the grass, see that it's tried to match the texture of the ground above. The same here is tried to match the color of the cliffs. Let's bring this into the game. So here I have a folder for a mod I've set up. I'm copying the Vox file over. Then I switch over to Teardown. It's an empty mod. Bring in a Vox file. Mod folder, the terrain. Look at that. There it is. The start position there. Maybe add some water. Okay, let's bring up the spawn point and something like that. Let's take a look. Looks pretty cool, huh? And that's how you create a voxel terrain from a mesh with use of VoxTool. VoxTool will be available from teardowngame.com/VoxTool, so you can download it and use it yourself. I hope this video was useful and that you've got enough information to start messing around with VoxTool. I will be back with a few videos diving deeper into some of the functionality of VoxTool and also looking at the different support functionalities of VoxTool. Have fun. Bye.